Hey everyone, welcome to Why Life Inspired. I'm your host, Scott Keys. Today, a photo basics series on Aperture, and this is part 3. We're going to talk specifically about backgrounds, Aperture, and a little bit about the way Aperture can affect the shape of the light entering the camera. I think you're going to find this one interesting. Of course, I've got a lot of examples to show you, and we'll get to all of that right after this. Now in this series around Aperture, I've done a few different videos, and in each video I dealt with a specific topic. The first video talked more or less about the opening and closing of the size of Aperture and how it impacted the light entering it. And I also showed you some of those numbers and broke those down for you. In the second video, I talked about depth of field. And while there are many variables to depth of field, I explained what depth of field was, and I even gave you some really high-tech animations around how Aperture changes depth of field. Now in this video, we are going to talk about Aperture again, and we're going to talk about specifically how it impacts things like backgrounds, bokeh, and even changes the way light enters the lens. Probably the biggest thing I want you to take out of today's video is that different physical openings, the actual way the opening is designed, can impact the output of the image. So the image can change based off of the lens you're using and the way that Aperture is designed. Now you got a lot of examples, so I'm going to show you this. We're going to focus on two types of changes. One is when we leave our Aperture wide open, when we make it really, really big, what happens? In another case, I'm going to show you what happens, what we can do when we make an Aperture really, really small and change the way light enters that Aperture. Now the first concept I want to talk about and how things change is when we stop these apertures down, and I'll start real big. I've used this in the past, so let's go, oh, there's my big. Okay, so I start big, and as I close that down, I can see a shape forming. And in this case, it's 7 blades, so I've got a 7-sided shape, and it's a polygon. Like you can actually see almost these lines around it. This is a slightly rounded aperture. The other thing I'm doing now is letting less light in, and the combination of those two things, the shape of that opening and the fact that it's very, very small, is having an effect. And when we apply that effect to a bright object like the sun or a street lamp, we get something called a starburst. May also be called a sunburst, may also be called a diffraction spike. Now, I'm not a landscape photographer, but we usually see this in landscape photography. I enlisted the help of 2 of my photography friends to show me some images that actually have a great example, and I'll put those 2 up here now. This is Santosh Shanmuga and Tyler Reber. And in both of these, you can see that that sun in the background has a really interesting pattern. It's got these long lines coming off of it. Those lines are created because of that small opening and the shape of that aperture, the shape of that aperture opening. So that diaphragm got small, but it also had this specific shape. The more rounded those openings are, the less of this effect you get. Let me take those pictures down and I'll show you the practical side by side. So what I did is I set up a really bright small object, and I selected the iPhone on the back of my camera because it's pretty bright. Darkened the room, and this, you typically see this in higher contrast areas. So dark versus light or light versus dark. When I open the aperture up, so I take this and I opened it, I shot 2 lenses. I did the 50mm f4, or I'm sorry, the 50mm f1.4 and a 40mm f2, which is what I'm actually recording this video with. With the opening wide open, with that aperture wide open, I didn't get this effect. And that's because all of that light is just kind of pouring in. It's very out of focus. Remember, when I open these apertures and make them wide, backgrounds get blurrier, things get more out of focus. So I didn't really get this starry effect, these long lines, these blades coming off the light. I did it with my 40mm lens, that's the one I'm showing you here. Did it with a 50mm lens wide open, didn't get the effect. But when I stopped it down, when I closed that aperture, I did. The first one is with that 40mm burst. And you could see these little streaks coming off. This 40mm lens has 9 blades that are rounded. And it is a fairly circular pattern even when it's stopped down. So I did get the effect I was looking for, but if you notice, the spikes coming off aren't very long. There are 9 of them. So the number of blades will it should always give you the number of spikes that will come off of that sunburst or that starburst. Let me show you the difference with the 50mm. This has an older lens. It only has 7 blades, and they come in at sharper angles. I showed you before, you can actually see the pattern. With this one, I got that effect. And this is a really great example, as I put them side by side, of how two lenses, very close in focal length, close in terms of aperture, when stopped down, both of these to f/16, I created two very different effects. Now, how does this impact you? Well, as a photographer, if you like this effect, it will directly be correlated to the type of lens you use, specifically the way that diaphragm is constructed and the way those blades are designed. Some will give you more, some will give you less. It depends on what you're looking for. Oftentimes, we think of like a focal length as determining the type of photography we're gonna do. Somebody might say, well, a 35 millimeter, it can do street photography, I can do landscape photography, I can do portrait photography, and maybe you can get away with some of that with this focal length, or even a zoom lens in that focal length. But if you want this effect, it might be a little bit more specific to the way the lens is actually designed. So while closing that lens down and having kind of an angular opening could be ideal for things like starbursts or sunbursts, it may not be great for all photography. As a wildlife photographer, I may want something that is smooth and creamy in the background. And for that, a different lens and even a different aperture might be more desirable. When you look at this background, it feels very, very dreamy. I like this effect, by the way, and so I covet these types of backgrounds often. And so this effect can be very, very appealing. We refer to these backgrounds as bokeh, and bokeh just being out of focus elements. It doesn't have to be restricted to the background. It could also be the foreground. Let me show you another image that I've got up here. This is one I took last year. And I really liked this. You could see some soft out of focus elements in the background, but I want you to notice those little drops of rain that are catching some light. By the way, if you can shoot the sun coming out right after the rain, you can get some really interesting photos, and that's exactly what happened here. A little bit of sun came out at dusk, right after a shower, and I got a really nice effect. But I want you to pay particular attention to those little balls of light, because that's what we're going to talk about next. These ideas, you may hear these called bokeh balls, but the idea of the shape of those bokeh balls and how it can be influenced by the diaphragm, the aperture, and the shape of that aperture. Now, to illustrate this, I made a couple videos right here in my house. Took some string lights, popped a camera on a tripod, and all I did was change the focus and then change the aperture. I started big and made it small. Let's watch this first video. This one taken with a macro lens. Now, you're gonna notice a couple things. The lights start off relatively in focus, and as I shortened the focus, as I pulled the focus back and made it smaller, the focal plane got closer to the camera, those balls of light became big. In fact, they became so big with this macro lens that they morphed into one giant out of focus element. As I pulled it back and started to push the focus back towards the light, I got a nice shape for these balls. And then I started to close the aperture. I started to crank it down, and you'll notice a couple things happen. Those really big circles start to get a little smaller. That's more an impact of the depth of field change. You may also tell that the pattern, the actual shape of those circles changed. And it might not be as obvious here, but I'm going to show you another video in just a second where it's going to be even more obvious. Let me show you a couple more images about how you can apply this to your photography. When you've got a background element that has light hitting it, we call these specular highlights. It's when light hits a shape and creates a highlight on that shape. Now, I get it a lot with ducks on water. The ripples in the water can create bokeh. I already showed you an example after a rainstorm. Let me show you a really pronounced example that I took at my house. Had those same conditions where it rained and the sun came out. I decided to take advantage of it and play around, so I captured the only bird that was around my yard, this house finch. But look at the amount of those balls of light. Those bokeh balls are just tremendous in the background. Also notice the shape of those balls of light, how they're essentially all round. I'm going to pop a video on here as I transition. I'm going to show you a couple more images, but watch what happens when those balls of light get off center. So we talked about aperture changing the shape. You will often notice those balls of light on the edges of your frame will alter the shape. They won't be perfect circles anymore. They start to turn into kind of ellipses. And those last few examples were all with these balls of light created by specular highlights, created by light bouncing off of another object. It can also be created by just a light source. Let me show you a couple here. This photograph was taken with a very distant light source. I think those were a couple of buildings over a bay. And I don't know if that was the sunlight reflecting off of it or it was some kind of light source back there, but let me show you one more. I'm sure it was a light source. These are city lights in the background. Now, all of these are created differently. In some cases, these backgrounds were a foot or two away. In this case, that background might have been 2 miles away. It is interesting effect, and it is all created by the shape. The shape of those lights is created by the shape of that opening. The more wide open it is, the bigger those balls will tend to get. The more closed down it is, the smaller those balls of light get, and the more shape we see from it. I mentioned this all in terms of background, but I told you bokeh isn't just about background elements. Let's look at a foreground element. Here we can see those balls of light in the foreground. A really interesting effect, and what I really want you to pay attention to. I'm going to show you 2 lenses. I had to dig way back into the archives for this next picture. I was trying to find a longer lens that had a different type of aperture opening. Now, the last few that I've showed you, you've seen some really rounded balls of light, and that is ideal for most wildlife photographers. Years ago, I shot with a Sigma 500mm 4.5 prime lens. Very few people use this. It was an older lens, but it had a different aperture shape. The opening was different. It was 9 blades, but when you look at that ball of light down at the bottom, you can really actually see the 9 sides of that circle. I thought this was a great example for this video because it shows you that even at 2 different lenses, both around 500mm, both around 4.5 apertures in their widest setting, when shot wide open, produced 2 different types of these out of focus specular highlights. So I thought that was a really, really great example. So as you see with that older lens, the shape of the opening changed. I've got one more video I want to show you. I'm going to show you a couple of specialty lenses before we head out today. But let me show you this video over here because it really illustrated the point. I took this 50mm lens and I showed you in the beginning it had 7 blades and they weren't as rounded when it was stopped down. So nice and round, wide open. Watch the shape of these lights change as I manually adjust that aperture. When I got down to f5, 6, and down to f8, look at I mean, you can see the shape, distinctly see the shape of that aperture opening. And that's a direct impact on what will happen if I were to shoot a scene like that with out of focus elements or light sources behind the subject. I would be able to see that physical shape, that 7-sided shape would show right through to the lens. I mentioned there's some specialty lenses out there. So this is by a company called Lens Baby, and they actually make these openings, these apertures in different shapes. So while you will not get sharp images from this, you could get some artistic images, and they've given you some examples there. Another company called TT Artisan, they make these bokeh effect lenses that you can buy. One of the effects called swirly bokeh, I've played around with in the past. I'll put an image up here that is an example of that. Now these can come from, again, specialty lens manufacturers. There are some vintage lenses that give you a similar effect, or you can even modify some old lenses to get this swirly bokeh. I've been playing around with this effect for a few years and I really like it, especially with my macro photography. And all of that is to say that Aperture does a lot of different things. Controls the light, the amount of light that comes in, controls depth of field, and it can add different effects depending on the light and the background and ultimately what your desired effect is. So you really do have to have an understanding of how that aperture shape can impact some of your images. And if you want to maximize some of these things like these out of focus bokeh balls or even those starbursts or sunbursts, you really do have to pay attention to the type of aperture and the shape of that aperture and how it's going to impact your results. Now, hopefully you found this whole series of Aperture videos interesting. If you did, go down and hit the like button. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Hit the bell for notifications. That'll let you know when I have a new video out. And I've got a lot of playlists down there. So there's some photo basics, some opinion pieces, and I do a lot of wildlife content down there. So make sure you find the playlist that's right for you. I appreciate you tuning into this one. And for my wildlife friends, I hope we can continue to find inspiration in wildlife together.